ever like really stop to think about just how wild it is that we can have conversations?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like we hear these sounds, boom, they're ideas, we're sharing thoughts. It feels so basic, you know?
Totally.
But then there's this study, it tracked something like 520,000 words across 100 hours of real talk, like people just chatting,
Wow.
trying to figure out how our brains do that, make sense of all that.
It's mind-blowing when you think about the sheer scale of it. What's so cool about this research, what makes it a real deep dive, is how they did it. They used this AI, it's called Whisper, super cutting-edge stuff, and it gives us this totally new angle on how our brains handle language, like in the messy, real-world way we actually talk, not just, single words in a lab.
Yeah, exactly. It's about how we actually use language out in the world. So, for our listeners, this means we're going to be looking at some seriously new insights into language processing, moving past the old theories, seeing the brain in a whole new light thanks to this computationally informed perspective.
Right on. Our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the juiciest bits from this research, the stuff that's really significant academically, the innovations. What makes this study stand out? What does it all mean for understanding language in the brain?
Okay, so let's like break down this innovation. For ages, neurolinguistics has been all about breaking language down into these neat little pieces, right? Phonemes, the sounds that make up words or parts of speech, nouns, verbs, that kind of thing.
Right, like taking apart a clock to see how all the gears work.
Exactly.
So traditional approaches, they often treat language as the system built from these like fundamental symbols. But this study, it takes a totally different road. It harnesses the power of deep learning using this model called Whisper.
And Whisper, it doesn't work with those like traditional blocks. It learns these things called continuous vector representations.
Embeddings, yeah.
It's like capturing the essence of a sound or a word in this mathematical space without actually like knowing what a phony or a verb is. And that's what's so radically different.
For real. Whisper is this multimodal model, acoustic to speech to language, meaning it can deal with sound, recognize speech, and then get the meaning of the language all in one system. The innovation is in those continuous embeddings. They learn to represent sound features, speech sounds, and the context of the language, all in this fluid, high-dimensional space, capturing stuff that, like, basic symbols might miss.
So the researchers used Whisper as what they called a unified computational framework. Can you like explain what makes that framework so important?
Absolutely. They're using Whisper to connect the dots, to go from the raw sound, the actual sound waves, to how the brain understands what's being said. They got three types of embeddings from Whisper: acoustic for the raw sound, speech for the processed phonetic stuff, and then language embeddings for meaning and context.
So each type of embedding kind of matches up with different levels of how the brain processes things.
You got it. They figured, and their findings back this up, that there'd be a link between these embedding types and what's happening in specific parts of the brain, the parts we know are involved in language. This unified framework lets them compare what's going on in the AI to the brain's neural responses directly.
Now, this study, it's way more real world than your typical lab experiment. They didn't use like a controlled environment, right?
Not at all. They went for ecological validity, big time. They recorded brain activity using ECOG, that's electrocortography, which means putting electrodes right on the brain's surface. They
Well,
did this with 4 patients who are being treated for epilepsy. But get this, they recorded 24/7 for like 100 hours, getting all these natural, unscripted conversations.
that's a crazy amount of data. In such a real life setting, it makes you wonder, what were they talking about, right? Different topics, emotions, so much variety compared to someone just reading words in a lab.
Oh, for sure. They made a point of saying that every conversation had its own social context and purpose, totally different from the controlled stuff they use in typical experiments. This let them study language in a way more authentic way. Of course, this also created some huge technical hurdles. They had to make the audio anonymous to protect the patient's privacy, transcribe everything, and then match the spoken words to the brain activity with pinpoint accuracy. A ton of data processing.
So they have this massive data set of real conversations, and they've used Whisper to make these different embeddings. What was like the most surprising thing they found when they compared the AI to the brain activity?
The big innovation, the thing that really stood out, was how the AI's processing layers lined up with how the brain's cortex is organized for language. It's like a hierarchy. They saw that the sensory and motor parts of the brain, like the STG, the superior temporal gyrus, which handles sound, and the pre-CG, pre-central gyrus, which is about controlling speech, those were way more correlated with Whisper's speech embeddings.
That makes sense, right? Those areas are all about the early stages of processing sound and actually speaking.
Exactly. And on the other hand, the areas that deal with higher level language stuff, the IFG, inferior frontal gyrus for syntax and meaning, and the AG, angular gyrus for comprehension, those were much more in sync with Whisper's language embeddings, the ones that represent meaning and context. This hierarchical mapping, this parallel between the AI and the brain, is a key finding, a real innovation.
It's almost like this AI, even though no one told it about brain structure, somehow learned to process language in a way that mirrors how our brains do it.
Yeah, like there are some fundamental rules that govern how systems, whether they're artificial or biological, learn to handle language.
The study also looked at the timing of language processing, how things happen over time. How did they use Whisper to study that?
Well, they had these ECQ recordings with millisecond precision. They were analyzing the brain in tiny 20 millisecond windows. And because they could track the flow of information in Whisper, they could see the exact sequence of how things happened when someone spoke or understood something.
So what about the timing? Did the AI sync up with the brain's patterns?
When someone produced speech, they saw this clear sequence. The language areas in the higher parts of the brain lit up before the speech-related areas that control the mouth. Like the brain figures out what to say before it gives the orders to actually say it. Language to speech. But when someone was listening, it went the other way around. The speech areas became active after a word was spoken, then the higher level language areas kicked in for understanding. Speech to language. And get this, Whisper did the same thing.
No way.
Yeah, they even found a planning stage in speech production, with brain activity peaking like 300 milliseconds before the person started talking.
That's seriously detailed analysis. It's not just about what the brain's doing, but when. And the AI shows the same timing.
Exactly. This level of detail, made possible by combining high-resolution brain recordings with Whisper's ability to track timing, gives us a brand new look at the state of producing and understanding language in the real world.
Now, one of the biggest claims of this study is that Whisper's embeddings are better than traditional linguistic features at predicting brain activity. That seems like kind of a big deal, right?
It's a huge finding. They went all out comparing how well Whisper's representations could predict what they saw in the brain against those traditional features like phonemes and parts of speech, the stuff that a lot of linguistic theories are based on. And Whisper's embeddings, they just consistently did a better job.
So this AI, even without knowing anything about grammar or sounds, is capturing something deeper about how our brains deal with language.
Yeah, that's the implication. It's like the brain might not be working with these separate symbols in the way we thought. These continuous embeddings seem to tap into a much richer code for language, a neural code. This is one of the most innovative parts of the study.
So are we saying we need to rethink some of the basic ideas about how language works in the brain?
It might be time for that, yeah. We got to look at alternative frameworks, other ways of understanding how the brain computes language.
There's this other thing I found fascinating, how the sound of speech itself influences the language representations in Whisper. What did they figure out about that?
Well, when they let Whisper actually hear the sound while it was trying to understand the meaning, by adding those auditory features, it got much better at predicting the brain's response in the language areas.
So the sound isn't just processed separately and then passed on. It's like woven into the process of understanding what's being said.
Right, the brain doesn't keep these things totally separate either. It seems like the constant sound input is shaping how we make sense of language.
Okay, this next thing, it blew my mind. Whisper, it was never trained on things like phoneme or parts of speech, those basic building blocks of language. But this study found that those concepts just popped up in its embedding spaces. How is that even possible?
This is one of the most surprising findings, for sure, and it could change everything. They use some fancy techniques, TSNE visualization, logistic classification, and they saw that Whisper's embeddings formed clusters that matched those traditional linguistic categories. Like they could predict phonemes from the speech embeddings with 54% accuracy and parts of speech from the language embeddings with 67% accuracy, both way better than chance.
Wait, so without anyone teaching it, the AI figured out these core concepts of language.
Yeah, that's the idea. This suggests that maybe these basic units, phonemes, parts of speech, the stuff we thought was fundamental, maybe they emerged naturally from the patterns in language itself, not from some pre-programmed rules. That has huge implications for how we think about language acquisition and what those building blocks really are.
So the AI is basically rediscovering what linguists have been studying for years just by processing tons of data.
Yeah, it's like those concepts are built into the very structure of language.
The study also mentioned something called mixed selectivity in the brain. What's that about?
It means that brain regions aren't just doing one specific thing, like processing only sound or only meaning. They're handling a mix of different information. They found that many language areas were responding to both speech and language embeddings, not just one or the other. So it's not like each area has one very specific job.
So more interconnected, less compartmentalized.
Right. And that probably helps make our language abilities more flexible and adaptable.
Okay, so big picture, what's the takeaway from this whole study? It seems like a pretty big shift in how we think about language in the brain.
Absolutely. It's pushing us towards using these computational models, like Whisper, as tools to understand how the brain processes language. They capture the complexity of real conversation, and they line up so well with brain activity, it's opening up new possibilities for research.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? Could this lead to real-world applications?
Definitely, these AI models could help us build better language processing systems, systems that are more robust, flexible, more like how humans communicate. The study also points to some exciting future directions, like models that go straight from sound to sound, no need for text in between, and models that incorporate other senses, not just sound.
So for our listeners, what are the key things to remember from this deep dive?
The biggest thing is how well this AI whisper matches up with the human brain during real conversations. That's huge. And this alignment is there at every level. The hierarchy of processing, the timing of speaking and listening, and the fact that Whisper's embeddings are better than traditional features at predicting brain activity.
And don't forget, this was real, natural conversation, not some made-up lab scenario.
Yeah, real talk. This study was innovative in so many ways. The naturalistic data, the use of this multimodal model, and the fact that it found those linguistic building blocks just emerging from the data. It's making us rethink some basic assumptions about language in the brain.
Here's something to ponder. Maybe the way this AI is learning language through tons of data and without explicit rules is more similar to how our brains evolved to process language than we ever thought. What those traditional rule-based theories are not the whole story. What does that mean for how we understand language and even cognition in general?
That's a deep question, and this research is definitely pushing us to ask it. It's opening up new frontiers in understanding language and intelligence, both in humans and in machines.
Lots to think about. If you want to go deeper, check out the original article in Nature Human Behavior. It's a deep dive in itself. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the brain and language.